So a very warm welcome to our game today, which is between Bobby Fischer and Bent Larsen, a game from 1958 where Bobby Fischer was just 15 years of age playing against his older and more experienced grandmaster. And this was in the Portoroz International in 1958. It was basically a qualifier for the candidates. So a massive tournament for such a young Bobby Fischer. But this is the game where he ended up saying, when it comes to playing the dragon, you push your pawn up the H file and you sack, and then end up mating your opponent. So let's check out the game. We had E4, C5 by Larsen, knight F3, D6, D4, C takes D4, knight takes D4, knight F6, knight C3, and as we said, the idea that Bobby Fischer said, push your pawn up, get your rook behind, sack, and you're going to win the game anytime you play against the dragon. Well, if it was that easy, of course, we play it all the time against the dragon, but let's see how the game unfolds. We have bishop E3 by Fischer, bishop G7 by Larsen, then we get F3, so we get the Yugoslav attack, which is definitely worth investing some time in learning if you play against the dragon a lot. Then we have castles, queen D2, knight C6, bishop C4, knight takes D4, bishop takes D4, bishop E6, and then bishop back to B3. As you can see, we're still in book. These are pretty common moves, easy to follow along what we're doing. Queen to A5, and then we have long castles by white, followed by B5, king to B1, B4 attacking our knight, and so we get knight to D5. So knight to D5, and after knight D5 in the game, Larsen decides to take the knight with the bishop, so he goes bishop to D5, and then Fischer takes bishops to D5 back. And here you could just take with the knight, and after pawn takes and queen takes pawn, you get queen takes a pawn and B4, and the game is pretty much an even game from here. But interestingly, in this game, Fischer's light square bishop was left uncaptured by Larsen. Instead, he decided to go rook to A, from A to C8, and Larsen brings back his bishop to B3, keeping this diagonal open for the attack and pinning the king to this pawn, or the pawn to this king, which we see is a very important part of Fischer's attack later. So we get rook to C7, now we get the pawn push up page 4, and we get queen to B5, which is an inaccuracy. And just highlighting again the weaknesses now in this area. With this pawn pinned, this means this, whatever pawn this ends up, if you can get rid of one of these defending pawns, this pawn here, that means whatever lands on this square is going to be free to take. So we get H5, we get rook to C8, we get H takes G6, and after H to G6, we're looking at this position where white is slightly ahead. But if instead of say rook to C8 here, if we had knight takes, we see the really strong attack that can be had by white here, because you get, after you trade off the dark square bishops, you get G4 attacking the knight, then you get queen to H6, and after king drops back, we get G5, knight to H5, and can you find the move here? It's a brilliant move, and it's rook sacrifice. And a rook sacrifice here leads to a mate in 5, would you believe? Because after the pawn takes, you just push the pawn again, and after H, the pawn takes. Because it's pinned, it means the queen can now take this pawn. So with check, king to H8, queen to H6 check, and after the king drops back, well, then you've got bring your rook to G1 check, and you have to block with the queen, and you have checkmate. So we can see the advantage of having this light square bishop, and the fact that Larsen didn't take it off, really leading to a lot of problems in the game if he doesn't play accurately. So if we remember correctly, we had HG6, and after HG6, now remember this pawn is pinned, let's not forget that, because of this pin here, this pawn is free to take. So we get G4. And now Larsen plays A5, which seems like a good move because it just seems, well, I'm going to push this and the light square bishop is going to have to move to here and I will be able to snap it off and make up for the mistake I had earlier. But we see that that's not the case because we get G5 by Fischer, forcing Larsen to have to move his knight. So after knight to H5, well, we've already seen what the correct way to play this position is. That's right. Brilliant move. Rook takes H5. So after rook takes H5 and pawn takes H5, we get G6, pushing the pawn, again taking advantage of the very fact that we have this pin going on. So Larsen realizing now he's in big trouble. Now if you look at the the computer says it's about 1.9, so +2. I think for most of us under whatever rating we are, unless we're at master level, I mean, you think, well, okay, we're slightly worse, but at this top level, nearly +2 is just unsurmountable at times advantage. And Larsen decides to go to E5, which is an inaccuracy because Fischer just takes pawn F7 with check, king to F8, and then we get bishop back to E3. Then we have D5 by Larsen, but Fischer just takes. He says, yeah, I don't care. And now, interestingly, you can't play A5 because you think, oh, I can play A5, but in fact you just go D6. And after you take, this is computer moves now, if you take the bishop, the computer wants you to take the bishop and then you take the rook, winning the exchange, and after black would take the pawn, you get this really beautiful move, which is bishop to B6, protecting the pawn. And of course, you can't just take it. It's a brilliant move in the game, but you can't just take it by the queen because, of course, you get check and you win the rook. And this game is completely dead. So in the game, after Fischer takes, Larsen decides to capture the pawn with the rook, and so we get D6. After D6, we get F6, and then Fischer attacks with G5, attacking Larsen's rook. And Larsen, again recognizing what a terrible position he's in, decides to drop back his queen to B7. So after taking the exchange and capturing back by Larsen, Fischer now plays D7, and so then we get D8 by Larsen, blocking the advance of the pawn. And here, I mean, the game is pretty much done and dusted. There's actually a mate in 3 on the board. Can you find a mate in 3? Interestingly, Fischer didn't find it. Fischer just played here the move of D6 check, which is a mate in 6, but there is a mate in 3. We'll start off here with H6 check, king to E6, and then after queen to H7 check. You can only block with the bishop, following up with queen to G7 check mate. So a really great game by Bobby Fischer. He ended up qualifying for the candidates with a score of 12 out of 20. Mikkel Tell winning the tournament with 13.5, and Larsen did not advance. He only ended up with 8.5. But 15-year-old Bobby Fischer, an unbelievable player, and what a joy that was to watch.